Chapter 24, Post-War Society and Culture. So in this chapter, we'll be looking at everything from xenophobia after the war to the younger generation and the new woman of the 1920s, pop culture, music and radio, the rise of the KKK, the age of consumerism, and then we'll end with Henry Ford and the invention of the airplane. So we're starting with closing the gates on immigration. So xenophobia did not end when the Red Scare passed. As millions of Europeans attempted to flee their own continent's devastation, Congress worked really quickly to bar their entry into the United States. And really, they were just bowing to nativist pressures, especially against Southern and Eastern Europeans. And Congress even established entry quotas based on national origin. Congress actually restricted overall immigration to a maximum of 150,000 people in 1929. So there was a strong dislike of the new immigrants, and many of them were Jewish, and this was simply related to the growth of anti-Semitism. And it wasn't because they were slow to adopt to American ways, or it wasn't because they were in any way dragging down Americans, but many of them were actually getting ahead, and people were fearful of that. And even prestigious colleges like Harvard and Yale began to put quotas on immigrants to filter them out. So new urban social patterns. So there was a census in 1920 that revealed for the first time that urban Americans outnumbered rural Americans. And this is a little bit skewed because their definition of urban was a community of 2,500 people or more. But city life did affect family structure, it affected employment, and certainly educational and cultural opportunities. Not to mention your ethnic background, socioeconomic status, your family size definitely played a significant role in determining what the family was like, whether women would work outside the home, or if they did, what their work pattern would be like, or if they would stay home. Compulsory education laws and child labor legislation limited the number of children working. And not to mention, there were new ideas about family life, such as companionate marriage, contraception, scientific child rearing, more easily obtainable divorces. All of these ideas began to gain currency. Many of these changes were related to people just leaving the farms, going to cities for work. Couples tended to marry more because of love as opposed to economic advantage. In each decade, more people married later, having less children. Husbands and wives dealt with each other as equals. And in 1927, there was an author, Benjamin Lindsay, who wrote The Companionate Marriage. And he proposed that couples should actually have a trial period of marriage before raising a family. There were childcare experts that argued that children needed medical exams. They needed to eat healthy food. They were, of course, divided about psychological development. Some said that you should love children unconditionally without restraint, and others argued that moms who kissed their sons too much would create mama's boys. So it seems like that's kind of an age-old argument there. It's still going on anyway. But the impersonality of large cities sort of loosened constraints on sexuality. There wouldn't necessarily be rumors circulating because the place was so large. There were so many people, as there would be in a small rural town. Homosexuality even developed a distinct culture. They came up with identifying signals, certain fashions, and later gay pride parades, nightclubs, etc. The younger generation. So young people began to behave in unconventional ways, and part of that was because they were adjusting to more rapid changes than previous generations. Trends that were barely perceptible during the progressive era reached avalanche proportions. Patterns of courtship changed. Respectable women smoked cigarettes in public. Women stopped wearing corsets. They wore lipstick. They cut their hair short. They shortened their skirts. Courtship went from paying calls or young people conversating, drinking coffee with parents, to dating. And of course, dating consisted of going off unsupervised, which led to sexual freedom. And parents worried about the breakdown of all moral standards. But the facets of the youth rebellion really reflected conformity to peer pressure. Young people's new ways of relating to each other were not merely a fad, and they were not confined to people under 30. It was sort of a generational shift. The new woman. So Margaret Sanger was a political radical. She was concerned about poor women who lacked knowledge of contraception. And she's the one that led the battle for birth control. She's also the founder of Planned Parenthood. But she was from Greenwich Village, which is markedly liberal. And she worked as a nurse who dealt with a lot of women who were burdened, in her eyes, by a large number of children who knew nothing about contraception. So she wrote articles, she designed pamphlets about contraception, and handed them out. And she ran into trouble with the Comstock Act of 1873. This was an anti-obscenity law that banned distributing information about contraception. And she was frequently in trouble with the law, but she did establish the American Birth Control League and 2 years later a research center. Other gender-based restrictions began to break down as well. Many states modified their divorce laws to try to protect women's rights. More women began to attend college. They worked. Women did still earn less than men and were excluded from most management positions. But radical feminists began to realize that the right to vote did not necessarily equate to their equality with men. And so they founded the Women's Party and campaigned for an equal rights amendment. And less radical women founded the League of Women Voters, and they campaigned more or less for broad social reforms. So pop culture, movies and radio. So popular culture changed dramatically as moving pictures grew in sophistication and appeal. Motion pictures were first made in 1900 but became popular after World War I. And the early films, like the 8-minute-long Great Train Robbery, were brief, they were action-packed, but they were pretty plain. By 1912, though, the United States had about 13,000 movie houses, as they were called. They were made from old stores called Nickelodeons because it cost 5 cents to attend a movie, or a nickel. But the success of these places really led to rapid technical and artistic improvements in movie making. They introduced sound in 1927, which brought a new level of technological maturity. Filmmakers like D.W. Griffith created an entirely new art in movie making. His Birth of a Nation was an artistic breakthrough, but it angered a lot of white liberals and blacks because of its sympathetic treatment of the Ku Klux Klan during Reconstruction. At any rate, by the 1930s, million-dollar productions were common. Charlie Chaplin was the greatest film star of the age. Cartoons were perfected by Walt Disney in the 30s. Even radio exerted a greater impact. Of course, during the war, the military controlled airwaves, but afterward, they were open for entertainment. And in 1926, the first continent-wide network was created. It was called the National Broadcasting Company. Radio soon brought a wide variety of public events into American homes. Presidential speeches, the news, an inaugural address, anything noteworthy was televised through radio and became available to every American who had a radio. The advertising industry financed a whole new industry. This became huge during this time. And they sought mass markets, so they actually preferred the uncontroversial intellectually light programs because they figured that most Americans would watch those and therefore most Americans would see their advertisements. The golden age of sports. So prosperity during this time, especially the 1920s, increased leisure time, radio, advertising dollars, all promoted the extraordinary popularity of sports. People had more money to spend, more free time available, so they went to sporting events, and there were even sports heroes that enthralled the American public. Harold Red Grange was the University of Illinois football player. Jack Dempsey, heavyweight champion. Bill Tilden, a tennis player. And of course, Babe Ruth, baseball player. But these stadiums were filled with crowds. And if you couldn't be there, then the radio brought the action into your living room. Football became the dominant college sport. And tens of thousands of Americans took up participatory sports like tennis and golf and water sports. So urban/rural conflicts, starting with fundamentalism. Rural America viewed the cities as a hotbed of sin and self-indulgence and overt materialism. And so religious fundamentalism sort of emerged as a reaction of rural conservatives to this new culture, this new urban culture. One of the evidences of this was the Scopes monkey trial. It really sort of typified the conflict between fundamentalism and modernism. And John T. Scopes was a biology teacher, and he was cooperating with the American Civil Liberties Union, or the ACLU, and he defied a Tennessee law banning the teaching of evolution in public schools. And he was sort of hesitant about it, but he reluctantly taught it, and as a result was arrested and tried. And so Clarence Darrow was the lawyer representing Scopes, while William Jennings Bryan, former presidential candidate, represented the state, and in a larger sense, rural fundamentalist America. During the trial, Bryan even offered $100 to anyone who would come forward and say that they descended from an ape. Although Scopes was convicted, many people believe that this trial exposed the ignorance and the danger of the fundamentalist position. But at the same time, the textbook that Scopes used gave a deficient account of evolution, and it presented the theory as irrefutable fact. It was also laced with bigotry. In the end, though, Scopes moved away from Dayton, the judge lost re-election, and Bryan actually died in his sleep a few days after the trial was over. So we'll go ahead and end there, and we'll pick up in the next one with urban-rural conflicts, prohibition.